We're now live. Good evening and welcome to the fifth session of the NUJS online lecture series hosted by the Student Juridical Association 2019 to 20 in collaboration with Live Law as our media partner. With us today, we have an extremely well-renowned personality, Mr. Vikramjit Banerjee, who's the Additional Solicitor General of India and actually the first National Law University graduate to hold this position. Mr. Banerjee would be talking on socialism and the Constitution and would be taking a 30-minute question and answer session at the end of the lecture. So do let us know your questions in the comment section. The session would be moderated by Professor Dr. Anirban Mazumdar, who's currently a professor at NUJS. Professor Mazumdar has immense experience in the field of intellectual property law, currently teaching a course on the same, and also having several publications in renowned journals across the globe. Dr. Mazumdar is also a fellow of the Max Planck Institute for Intellectual Property and many such international organizations across the globe, as well as being a visiting professor at several prestigious universities. We'd like to thank both guests for agreeing to this discussion. And without further ado, I'd like to hand over the mic to Professor Mazumdar to introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you, Ayushi, and good evening to everyone. Let me welcome you all to this fifth edition of NUJS online lecture series. And let me take this opportunity to congratulate President, Vice President, and other office bearers of Student Juridical Association of NUJS for taking initiative to organize this lecture series. And I'm sure that our students are taking a benefit out of it, and they are getting enriched by all the speakers in this series. Now, the country is going through this unprecedented time of pandemic situation. Due to the grace of technology, we all can connect to each other, and we are taking advantage of that in this lecture series as well. Now, when we switch on to the television, we see two pictures side by side. One that, how celebrities are spending time during lockdown by either cooking or some other thing, which is the picture of modern India. And we also see the migrant laborers walking kilometer after kilometer. And for a few of them, maybe the last walk of their life. And that's the Bharat. Both the pictures are real, both the pictures are the fact. And in this scenario, it is pertinent that we revisit our view of socialism and Indian Constitution. And who can do this job better than my good friend Vikramjit Banerjee? Vikramjit will remember we had a professor in National Law School, Bangalore, called Professor Devidas. Professor Devidas used to say that there are different flavors of our constitution. He was of the opinion that our constitution is presidential, giving a presidential form of government. So I'm sure that Vikramjit will give us his dimension of socialism, and we will see. I'm sure we'll have a very interesting interaction. And to introduce to you Vikramjit, who is definitely known as today Additional Solicitor General of India. He is also Advocate General of former Advocate General of Nagaland, yeah. And then he is a Sevening scholar. And more important identity for him is that he was former colleague of NUJS. He is one of the founding faculty of NUJS, as an institute. And I'm sure he remembers our initial days of journey in Aranya Bhavan under Professor Menon's leadership. So, without wasting further time, I hand over the mic to Vikramjit. Vikramjit, floor is yours, and let us hear from him.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Anirban. I think Anirban and myself, we go back a very long time. I think we go back to the National Law School where we studied together. And then we had the good fortune of working together at NUJS when it first started. I think just a small line before I start, I think my being a teacher at NUJS was as important in my journey as a lawyer as much as my studies at the National Law School. And I see both of them together. And today, the success of NUJS I feel deep pride in. I take great pride in that, and I identify a lot with NUJS. That being said, I think the point which Anirban sort of ended his short introduction was also extremely crucial. But I won't address that because I don't want to address anything which today smacks of too much politics. I'll only discuss the constitution and socialism. How has the court discussed it? And what were the politics of socialism which sort of underlines it? But to take off at the place where Anirban left it, I would only say this, that all of us must realize that the pictures which you see, as Anirban talked about, the celebrities working out and having their wonderful dinner and lunches, which they're putting on Facebook and Instagram, is inextricably linked with the pictures of migrants. One of the reasons being that the economy which we sort of promoted post-90s and which we were all very, very, very proud of had two faces. We knew that, and it was an aspirational economy that we all aspired to that. But the truth which this huge pandemic, and this is once in 100 years pandemic, once in 100 years event, has exposed, is that how fragile this entire scenario that we had constructed was. And that when you took away the sheen of the wonderful sheen of the economy, which had sort of driven us for the last 40 years, it was based on a very rough interior. That rough interior was based on a huge amount of exploitation, I would say, of labor to maintain this wondrous lifestyle which usually used to come on Instagram and Facebook. How we will deal with it after this pandemic ends, and I'm sure it will end, is a question which we all need to contemplate now, because we may not be able to at the present see the end of the hill, but we will soon be at the peak of it, and then the only thing which we will see is coming down the hill. And when coming down the hill, this entire question of poverty, of wealth, of what do we mean by socialism, are questions which are going to haunt us. So in many ways, this topic which I intend to address before you is a first of. I have tangentially written on it and publications in the SEC, but very tangentially. But this is a question which I think we should address now, because this is something which we are going to face in future. Now, socialism, as we know, is not a new idea in the Indian Constitution. It is an idea which has been there for a very long period of time. It was brought into the Indian Constitution explicitly by the 42nd Amendment. A lot of people are not agreeable to that amendment because they think that that amendments were rushed and large parts of it was amended. But all of us also know, and know historically, that before India became independent, there was this huge debate which preceded India's independence, and the questions were raised a number of times as what sort of country would we inherit, because we were coming from the British Raj into this independent country. Like we all discussed about secularism, and we also discussed socialism. In fact, there was a huge faction in the Congress which explicitly pushed for India to be declared a socialist country. But we must also realize that that didn't actually work, because there was a large amount of people within the Congress who pushed back against this idea of socialism. We know Rajaji was one of them. We know Sardar Patel was one of them, and they were very explicit. In fact, some of the exchanges over socialism and the place of socialism in the Indian constitution and in the to-be Indian state was extremely bitter. One of the persons in the middle was, of course, Pandit Nehru, but on the left there were strong proponents, people like Acharya Narendra Dev, people like Jayaprakash Narayan, people like Ram Manohar Lohia, who were part of a socialist group in the Congress and very, very adamant in pushing for a socialist state. And there were others, and I'll address that. And on the right, if you so much look at it this way, was Rajaji. There was also very famously Sardar Patel. Sardar Patel came from very humble backgrounds, came from a farmer's family, and he pushed against this socialism a number of times. There have been very, very bitter exchanges. Somewhere between both, there were Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, who was a very charismatic figure in the Congress, and Pandit Nehru. But again, Subhash Chandra Bose, and since we are discussing this, we should also discuss this, and I'll address this in my topic later, had views which could be today construed to be quite controversial. Pandit Nehru had very little to specifically say about socialism, though he was known to be a socialist, and in his first part of his autobiography about his travels to Russia, wrote very glowingly about socialism. But thereafter, he seemed to be shying away from taking a clear stand, even during the Constituent Assembly debates. But for whatever it's worth, it's important to remember that it was greatly debated. This entire concept of whether we should have a socialist state and what sort of a state we should have post-independence was debated. It was debated at the Constituent Assembly level. And a number of times, just like secularism was attempted to be brought into the Constitution, socialism was also attempted to be brought into the Constitution. In fact, a number of times, both of them were attempted to be brought in together as part of the same amendment. And, I'm fond of saying this, that after this back and forth, and after the numerous attempts to incorporate socialism and secularism as parts of the Constitution, famously, Babasaheb Ambedkar, who was clearly not a socialist, in spite of the spin which is being given to him. He was a great economist. He had a doctorate, I think, in economics. He had a doctorate in economics from London School of Economics and a doctorate in law from Columbia. He was by no means a socialist in the manner which we know. Babasaheb Ambedkar got up in the Constituent Assembly and he said very, very clearly, he said, we do not want our future generations to be saddled with any specific values. And that was the end of the debate. Now, K.T. Shah attempted to bring forth these amendments, and K.T. Shah gave a very long speech asking for socialism to be incorporated. And Babasaheb, in that famous, now very oft-quoted speech, shot it down. Now let's come to the text of the Constitution. This is something which we should, all talk about. Where is sort of social justice? We knew one thing, and that's apparent to all, that we were a poor country. There were differences in wealth. There are differences in status. There are differences based on economics. There were differences based on social differences. And we had to address that. Babasaheb himself addressed that. And he was at the forefront of that. But he did not classify himself as a socialist, but something as more akin to a person who has a deep belief in for the want of a better word, market economics, but wanted tools to bring in social justice. Now, so social justice was definitely incorporated into the Constitution. Now, any one of us who read the preamble knows that it was economic social justice was incorporated into the Constitution, right in the preamble. And then specifically, there are two provisions which all of us are very, very familiar today, because they have given rise to a large amount of contest, a large amount of pushback and back and forth, is the concepts of reservation. Article 15 and Article 16. Now, they were both incorporated into fundamental rights, 15.3, 15.4, 16.3, 16.4. These are social justice provisions. These are social justice provisions which were specifically incorporated into the Constitution. And these were in many ways far, far ahead of their times. Because as we know, the South African Constitution came much, much later to have these social justice provisions, which I think Baba Sahib, because of his experience of being and studying at Columbia, came back with, was incorporated into the Constitution as a means. Because in America, these questions were being hugely debated as to whether you should have reservation, what sort of reservations, whether reservation was a tool for affirmative action. If not reservation, then what? The Americans went down on a different route altogether, but that's not the topic of this discussion today. Now, the other provision which was incorporated, which can be classified, is of course Article 17. Article 17 was the untouchability provision, which banned untouchability. Article 18, which banned titles. So in many ways, even if we explicitly did not inherit a socialist state, we did inherit in some ways an egalitarian state, because the ethos of the Constitution at that point of time, for however we sort of inherited it, was egalitarian. Now, and I say this very specifically because, you know, sometimes when I was young as well, and I've been at very different points of time, even explored this idea as to whether there was almost a libertarian constitution when we framed it. It's easy, and it would be, I think, and in retrospect, not historically correct to say that we wanted a completely libertarian constitution, like the Americans. The Americans had a completely different history as to why they went in for a libertarian constitution, including the fact of the conflict with their mother country at that point of time, Great Britain, and that is why they came out with absolute fundamental rights. But for us, the question was more nuanced, because the realization that we were in a deeply divided, unequal country, unequal society, led us to believe that we need egalitarian constitutionalism. You know, even going back, you know, Swami Vivekananda, who was such a radical philosopher, always stressed that, you know, you may not be a socialist, but in this country you have to be a person who has concern for the poor. So concern for the downtrodden, concern for the poor were like right up there in even Swami Vivekananda's consideration. That was he died in 1902. So in 1898 onwards, there were people across the board. You know, why only Swami Vivekananda? There were large amounts of people who were deeply concerned about this concept of the unequal nature of the Indian society. So this concept of socialism was always in people's minds. But you know, another provision which you know, all of us have, I think, seen, and all of us have thought but never applied too much, is the various different provisions in directive principles of state policy. Now, all of us know that directive principles of state policy was not incorporated as fundamental rights, not made legally implementable, because people could not arrive at a consensus as that whether we wanted, you know, to bring those values into the Constitution, which, as Baba Sahib said. So those values which were perceived to be key to the running of this country, which we all aspired to, was sort of kept in a separate basket, and that was the directive principles of state policy. Now, all of us know that there were, you know, Article 38, which were the social provisions that said that, you know, the benefits of society should be distributed to to everybody, and there should not be accumulation of wealth. And there were Article 39, which said material resources should be so dispersed so that it, sort of benefits everybody, so that it doesn't detract from the common good. 38 and 39 were very clearly socialist principles in many ways. I think they were, if somebody has to be inspired as to what, if there is any sort of a place where you can say that the Constitution is socialist, I think the inspiration would have to come from Article 38 and 39 of the Constitution. If we take Article 15, 16, 17, and 18 to be social justice principles, there is a group of scholars who have always said that social justice principles are primary and socialism was not too keen. But then if you go to directive principle state policy, maybe Article 38 and 39 can give you some inkling as to what the thinking at that point of time was. Now, of course, subsequently, Article 51A was incorporated in the Constitution. And there was this huge kerfuffle over Article 300A, that's the right to property. I won't go into great details. Our right to property, there was a right to property. It was subsequently taken away, and then they could decide as to how to frame the fundamental rights. And it was decided that you make it a constitutional right. 51A was incorporated, was classic socialist constitutionalism in its thinking. You brought in fundamental duties. There is nowadays a push to sort of construe Article 51A as maybe rights versus duties. It is for the first time duties incorporated into the Constitution, and that's an Indian part of it. Sometimes even I've said that maybe you can use 51A to give an Indian flavor to the Constitution. But at that point of time when 51A was brought in, it was clearly inspired by socialist principles of socialist constitutional making, because both Soviet Union, China, there was a great stress on the fact that you did your duty to your state and country. So these were the broad sort of provisions in the Constitution, where which could be seen as those provisions which inspired some sort of social justice, socialism, which were to dictate as to what sort of constitution we were. Then, of course, famously, during the time when the right to property was made a constitutional right, in and around that point of time, there was this huge struggle, and the government of that day was going through a tough time, and they then incorporated, by an amendment, they changed the preamble, incorporated socialism and secularism by the 42nd Amendment, famously into the Constitution. The argument for secularism was that it was always implicit in the Constitution. The argument for socialism still remained in the air, but it was specifically included because it was felt that they were the two cornerstones on which Indian Constitution and Indian society was going to be based in the future. Now, in and after that, and the entire question then arose was, how important is socialism to the Constitution? And it is to discuss this issue in detail. It's very important as to how have the courts dealt with this entire concept of socialism. They've dealt with it variously. They've spoken on it variously. But you can take it from me that they've not been very clear. At least in the question of secularism, the courts have been very clear. The courts have said very specifically that secularism means sarva dharma samabhav. That is, everybody is to be treated, all religions are to be treated similarly. Or ekam sat vipra bahuda vadanti. It's like the wise treat, there is one truth, and people treat it differently. The wise know that there is one truth. But sarva dharma samabhav is the crux of the definition of secularism. In case of socialism, I will take you in conclusion of what the Supreme Court has roughly come around, but there has been no perfect definition. Now, this entire concept of socialism and social rights and social duties and the struggle of socialism, what sort of a social friendly or of socialism friendly state we had, has both happened in the polity which is extremely important to discuss when we discuss constitutionalism, and when we discuss a constitutionalism which keeps in mind the political developments, because as I've numerously discussed and a number of times said, that you cannot discuss constitution independent of your culture. You cannot discuss constitutionalism independent of the politics which happens. Now, the first sort of great challenge and first sort of great debate of socialism happened in India was on the question of land reforms. Now, we know there was a huge back and forth of land reforms. The Congress had this as part of its agenda, had part of anti-zamindari legislation, as it would say. It wanted to push forward these reforms because it said it was the key to make India an egalitarian state. This was, a number of legislations happened. This was challenged in court, and on various times there was pushback from the courts. But the courts on various occasions, including Kameshwar Singh, pushed back against the government. But the government eventually won the round and sort of made these changes, which the courts then upheld. It's largely these changes were equitable distribution of land and land ceilings and expropriation of lands. Because at that point of time, we thought to have a socialist constitution, we should have an equitable distribution of land. All of us, again, who have an understanding of constitutional law and understanding of how important land is, will know that it's not a uniquely Indian issue, though we tend to think it is a uniquely Indian issue. In post-colonial states like Zimbabwe, in South Africa, that still remains a very, very big issue as to who owns the land of the country. The next question was of nationalization. Then this was the 70s, where there was a huge move to nationalize industries because it was taken to be that private entrepreneurs were largely exploitative in nature. This, of course, had a huge impact. Elections were won and lost. General elections were won on the question of bank nationalization. Courts pushed back. But eventually, again, the government of the day won. We've all read R.C. Cooper, but we know the courts pushed back, but then the government of the day actually, in conclusion, won. A third area of great contestation of socialism was the entire question of labor rights. This was the time, labor rights was the time of Krishna. There was a huge debate of labor rights. There was a large amount of how do you define labor, what sort of benefits do they get, what happens if there is termination, are they entitled to full wages? We have, all of us know that we've all, read Firestone, and there were a large number of judgments in around that point of time. Though there were exceptions like Excelware, but nonetheless, the broad thinking was, you should give full labor rights, and labor rights should be given to maximum so that the labor actually benefited and they were not exploited. The fourth sort of an issue, which became the great crux of social justice and which remains the crux of social justice today, there's a back and forth on that, is the entire question of reservation, which came through Indra Sawhney. Indra Sawhney, when it came, the entire question of Mandal, the entire question of OBC reservation, the entire question of reading 15.4, 16.4 was revolutionary. Now, I don't know how many of you know that the entire question of caste is class, which became to be a cornerstone of Indian jurisprudence to an extent, was formulated by the Supreme Court, arose out of a absolutely near same framing of the principle of Ram Manohar Lohia. Now, Lohia, as any one of us have read Lohia, was a socialist. He was a maverick, a great socialist, and still is sort of the inspiration for big political parties like RJD, like Samajwadi Party. So Lohiaism still remains a very, very important component of Indian politics. And Lohia specifically spoke about caste is class. So this formulation was incorporated into Indrasoni, which then becomes this area of huge contestation, because you move away from a principle where you actually said that an individual could be treated based on economics to something more than economics. So the criteria for giving him reservations or giving him affirmative action does not anymore remain merely economic class which he belongs to, but also social class, which thereafter translates into caste. So very interesting, very interesting. This was, for the want of a better word, some sort of social justice or socialism with Indian characteristics, as Ramon Lohiya would have probably loved classifying it as. The third, which the sort of the fourth or fifth, I think that's 1, 2, 3, 4. The fifth big issue which we sort of came, and this came to us recently. We're all in law school, but this came maybe 10 years back, was right to land. I think this was individual small farmers' right to land. This was the basis on which the now famous Singur, Nandigram agitations were carried out. This became an all-India movement against land and land acquisition, because it was felt at that point of time that small farmers were being deprived and land was being acquired and then given over to industry at throwaway prices. The Supreme Court again had a great say pushing the issue. In Justice Singhvi's judgment in Greater Noida Authority, I think this entire question was pushed. And though Supreme Court, there was a Justice Sinha's judgment previously which had talked about the question that maybe right to property, even though it was taken away as a fundamental right, was and made into a constitutional right, still remained a human right. Now, all the entire argument was brought back into these cases through the entire agitation, which was a political agitation, and which was reflected in the court by Greater Noida Authority. And the last example, which I would like to say, is workers' rights. This is the entire question of migrant workers' rights. Is what was the basis of the economy of post, for the want of a better word, post 1990s, the aspirational economy, which we had all talked about, which we were all very proud of, which was actually predicated on contracted labor. And so what sort of rights do these contracted laborers have? What do these, this was a great site of contestation. All of us would have known that there was even a time in the 90s when government was sort of employing, and it still does, to a great extent, employs contracted labor. Previously, these appointments were regular appointments. They were government employees, but now the government decided that these were inessential functions in along with market economics. And therefore, the government wanted to vacate that space. So, and of course, there was a huge amount of, I think, labor issues about of selection, because selections tended to be greatly litigated. Government jobs were highly priced, so they were litigated regularly in court. There was a huge sort of, people wanted those government jobs. So the government decided to come out of employment and sort of contract these jobs out. And this entire politics of that was who would get it, whether there can be ad hoc appointments, whether government could then appoint whoever it wanted to, etc., came before the court, because there was a tendency of the government before that to appoint people whoever it deemed fit. So this entire question, one aspect of it came in Uma Devi, where again, I think it was Justice Singhvi's judgment, where they clamped down on this sort of employment, ad hoc employment, which even the government was doing. So these are some of the areas which the Supreme Court dealt with, and these were actually live political issues. All these issues in many ways sort of describes the concept of socialism, which pervades our constitutionalism as we have it today. Now, I think, as I said, right in the beginning that when one discusses the concept of socialism, one shouldn't, and as an Indian constitutional scholar, one should not, and that's my view, should not discuss only judgments or provisions of the Constitution, because both the provisions of the Constitution, as I said, even the judgments are not given in a vacuum. They are specifically given in political context, because there was a huge political debates also which permeate constitutionalism. And before I sort of come towards the end of my uh, talk, I would sort of highlight is what are the broad contours of socialist thinking, or the broad strands of socialism which we see in Indian politics. And this is very important for us to know, because that would again help us to interpret the constitution as we see it in front of us, and sort of identify as to what brand and what sort of interpretation we want our socialism, because this is socialism with Indian characteristics to be. One is, of course, social justice. This is something which we are used to, something which we face every day. This is the question of reservation. The entire question of caste is class, the entire question of affirmative action, the entire question of whether identity is what is important for one to get benefits from the state, or whether one should have economic deficit, be economically backward in some way or the other. Now, this is an extremely important debate on socialism, on social justice, which permeates our constitutionalism as we see it. And it's a live issue. All of us know about it. The other interpretation of socialism, as we have seen, has been something which is not too much in vogue, but which is there in the constitution. There were Gandhian provisions in part of DPSPs 38 and 39, as we discussed, which was articulated by Jayaprakash Narayan and also by Deen Dayal Upadhyay. And this is something which I think which we have to take into account increasingly. And this is what I will come back to right at the conclusion of my talk, is that they believe that you have to, an Indian definition of socialism would actually need to ensure that everybody's boat is lifted together. It was the individual would have to be, the interests of the individual would have to be subsumed in the betterment of society. Now, Gandhiji spoke about that. Gandhiji called it the word, he used the term Sarvodaya, and which is an old Jain term. And this is something which I will return to at the end of my talk. The other person who really spoke much about it and who came to be a great proponent of it and a great convert to it, because he started off as a socialist and then converted to it towards the end, was the famous Jannayak Jayaprakash Narayan. Because JP always believed that he was a socialist, and then he said that over a period of time, I have come to the conclusion that Mahatma Gandhi was right. And when he said that you can't have individual rights, and he said, I am disillusioned by the socialism of the West. And I think Gandhi's interpretation of what he considered socialism, or Gandhi's interpretation of having a society where the interest of society subsumes that of the individual, is something which you could want to follow. One of the reasons why, of course, he stressed is because he wanted Sampurna Kranti, which is root and branch revolution in society. And he looked beyond parliamentary politics itself. The other person who spoke about something similar is Antodaya, which the Prime Minister quite refers to about. Antodaya is by Deen Dayal Upadhyay, where he says that you have to have daya, or where the state should look after, that the obligation of the state is to have daya, is to look after the last person on the line, Antodaya, the last person on the line. So in any case, more or less, it's largely the same thing, that you have to ensure that the interests of both are protected, because the interests of society could in some ways ensure that the weakest are not exploited, to the wall. As Vivekananda says, as Gandhi said, Sarvodaya was a method to ensure that the weakest were not exploited. So I think both Antodaya and Sarvodaya actually sort of supplement and complement each other. The third way of interpreting of having an economic model is what we call Swatantra. Now, Swatantra is, of course, all of us are famously aware of Swatantra because Swatantra itself was formulated by Rajaji, and this seems to be a cornerstone of all free market ideologues in this country when they all talk about Rajaji very fondly, and they quote only one of his writings called Wise Swatantra, which he wrote at the time of when he launched his Swatantra Party, which was very obviously in many ways a market-based a party which sort of upheld the individualism in many ways. But this is my view that if you have to read Swatantra, you cannot read it independently of another work of Rajaji called The Hindu Way of Life, where he said that along with Swatantra, that is your individual right or right to do, Swatantra being ability to do anything, it has to be balanced by your obligation to ensure that you restrain your demands. So you cannot have an indefinite sort of exploitation. Your right is tempered by your inherent restriction which you place upon yourself. But he says that this inherent restriction should be upon the individual, and it is the duty of the state to ensure that the individual sort of conforms to this restraint which he puts upon himself. The third is, of course, Samajwad. Samajwad, it's very important. Samajwad, there are still Samajwadi parties today, and I would flag Ram Manohar Lohia, who talked about Samajwad. It comes directly from Ram Manohar Lohia, who talked about social justice, who talked about socialism with Indian characteristics, and where he spoke about that there should be caste is class. And in India, he still says, still caste is an extremely important thing. And that famously, his famous formulation that there are three markers of development in India is wealth, English language, and upper caste. But that was his view on that, and there are still political parties who are deeply sort of inspired by Ram Manohar Lohia's formulation of Indian society, as well as the remedies to it. The other is a variation of Samajwad, which I like to say is something called Samyavad, which was Indianized central planning system. This was the word Samyavad is what Subhash Chandra Bose formulated his version of socialism, which he interestingly conceptualized as a halfway between between fascism and communism, and with Indian characteristics, which will take care of the bad bad aspects of both. So he wanted centralized planning, and this was Samyavad of Subhash Chandra Bose. The other was, of course, socialism, which we all know. This was used as an active word in the 70s. And this, I sort of look at it in this way. This seemed to be the thinking behind the Indian National Congress's approach to socialism, where this came out of Congress's thinking out of the Bombay Plan. I don't know how many of you have read the Bombay Plan. Please read it. Bombay Plan was a plan which came out with all India's top industrialists getting together and sort of just at the time of independence coming out with a formulation as to how is India to be governed, or how is the economics of India to be governed more precisely. Now, they sort of came out with this formula that the industrialists will be in charge of manufacturing, and the distribution of it would be in the hands of the government, which will distribute it equally. This was socialism with Indian characteristics, our middle path, which used to be so discussed in the 70s. And so, all of us who've grown up in the 70s and 80s know that it was very largely discussed, and was almost a way of life for us. And the last, I think, is the entire concept of Swadeshi, which seems to be the flavor of the month. It's being discussed all over. Now, Swadeshi goes through three parts of it. One is the formulation of Surendranath Banerjee, where Surendranath Banerjee discussed Swadeshi as actually a political tool. He said this is a political tool to ensure that people of our own country buy our own goods, because the arrangement between India and Britain is based on exploitation, and Britain was selling her goods to India. And if we go for a trade boycott of Britain, it would effectively destroy the basis of the Indian British Raj. Then, of course, was the much more nuanced policy, and I think this is something which you should all read, and this is something, this part of Swadeshi I identify, was Lal Bal Pal's Swadeshi. Bipin Chandra Pal, Lala Rajpat Rai, and Bal Gangadhar Tilak. They came out with their own conception of Swadeshi at a different time, before Mahatma Gandhi came onto the stage, where their Swadeshi was India should manage, and this is what coincides with what the Prime Minister spoke about, and interestingly, was basically Swanirbarata. What the Prime Minister talked about is that you manufacture in your own country, you try to manufacture as much in your own country, but you trade with the world. You don't withdraw from the world, you trade with the world, but you ensure large amounts of manufacturing goes within your own country. Now, if you, I would suggest if anybody's interested in reading, one should read Bipin Chandra Pal, who's discussed a lot on this, on his conceptions of Swadeshi in great detail. The last is, of course, the Gandhian model of Swadeshi, which based on a village-centric life, which was based on Gram Swaraj, which based on, in very many ways, rejection of the material civilization of the West, and sort of belief that, you know, we have to go back to the basics, that we have to have cottage industries, and it is cottage industries, it is the small industries and agriculture which forms the basis of the Indian state. And that is the sort of Swadeshi, that is the sort of socialism which we should all look forward to. Now, this is where this entire concept, and to conclude, this is the entire concept of where we are now at. Now, the Supreme Court in DS Nakara very famously said that, you know, our socialism is a socialism which sort of mixes Gandhi and Mahatma Gandhi and Marx, and they talked about Gandhian socialism. But, you know, I have a different take of it. You know, I would like to say that the interpretation which the Supreme Court needs to give socialism in the future, because these challenges will be faced by the Supreme Court again after a hiatus from 1990 to 2020, a period of maybe 30 years. Because these questions of poverty will again come before the court, which the Supreme Court, you know, had some perchance, some ability to not address those questions. Because poverty is going to be a severe challenge subsequent to the pandemic, is the entire question of, you know, how to interpret the words of socialism, which permeates this constitution. You know, when Gandhi formulated this entire concept of Sarvodaya, he said, good of one person is enveloped in good of all. He said there should be dignity of labor, and, you know, one should be proud of the work which one is doing. These were the cornerstones of Sarvodaya, which interestingly, he also sort of was inspired by another British author called John Ruskin when he formulated this, but he enveloped it and he deeply enriched it with Jain philosophy. So my view in the end is this, that however much we talk about it, there are two sort of things which, two sort of pillars on which I see the future participation of Indian socialism should be, and the court should take deep inspiration from it. One is the concept of Swadeshi, and I personally contribute more to possibly a pragmatic conception of Swadeshi, but also balanced by the conception of Sarvodaya. So if today the challenge to the Supreme Court would be how to define socialism in the Indian Constitution, I would ask it to be inspired by both the two twin concepts of Indian concepts. And I say this very, very clearly, that we have to define it in terms of the Indian context of two Indian words of Swadeshi and of Sarvodaya. I don't know how all this will play out, but we live in extremely challenging times. The future is difficult to comprehend. We will get through the pandemic. There is no problem. Eventually, we will, but we will face very, very tough questions, both socially and economically, once we are past it. And I think it's time that the Supreme Court takes a look at socialism and tries to balance its views in a way which is in consonance with both Indian culture, which includes both material needs and wants, but like Swadeshi and Sarvodaya, also has a cultural and a spiritual element. Thank you very much.
Bikramjit, that was excellent, and very rich in history, as usual, as a trademark of Bikramjit's presentation. There are several questions, but before we take a few of them, Bikramjit, I'd like to have one comment from you.
Yeah.
No, it's mainly based on policy. That do you think that for this disinvestment or privatization, should the government be given a free hand, or should there be a screening system where you run them through the lens of socialism? Do you think that there is a need for that?
Anirban, I think in the end is, we've had largely, as I said, from 1990 onwards, we grew up in the end. You've seen me debating on free market in the National Law School. You would have seen me being one of the great propounders of free market. I remember standing up to Babu Matthew, whom you would know as a socialist in National Law School, and telling him whatever you know is wrong, and whatever you have studied is wrong. Being very, very aggressive about market welfare and believing that everything in the market is good. We've realized all of us have realized that we've been disillusioned by it. We've seen that not everything works in the market. And I think that in many ways, increasingly after the pandemic, and this is the reason why I chose this topic right now to speak about, is after the pandemic, we need to run it through that lens of Sarvodaya and Swadeshi. Socialism, that's why I said it has to be a creative interpretation of socialism. So we have to use these twin interpretations, like we have done for secularism. We have Indianized secularism. We have said Sarva Dharma Samabhav. So similarly, we need to use Indianized socialism and use Swadeshi and Sarvodaya, both which have cultural terms, and sort of run through it. I agree with you completely.
Bikramjit, there are a few questions. I'll take few of them. One
Yes.
of them is very pertinent for educational institution at this point of time. This is a question by Shuravi. Let me just check. Shuravi. One sec. Yeah, Shuravi. Is deprivation of attending online classes due to poverty and infringement of right to education or right to life of a poor student in a broad sense, if not under the purview of socialist pattern of our egalitarian society to provide every opportunity to everyone to avail the technological benefit? Shuravi Ghosh.
Okay, I'll address that question. I think that's very, very interesting question because, and this question and this time, usually when we move from when we move from socialist, a sort of a socialist government, which we sort of had, which we grew up in the 70s, and then we moved to in the 1990s to a free market economy, which Anirban and myself, we lived through those times and we saw how the world changed. We had some time to change. This has happened extremely rapidly, where you talked about an aspirational economy, aspirational tools, and your cell phones being the means of actually being able to order the world, and every even poor person would have access to cell phone. And now you have a situation where there's been complete deprivation. People have the economy. I don't know. we are in terrible times. We are in terrible times. We hope that it gets better, and I'm sure it's get better. We'll all go through this. But the question is not that. The question is, of course, in many ways, there is a difference. There is a difference, and there are people who don't have access to the online media, are into some ways disadvantaged. But as I said, we have to ensure what is the benefit of everybody, and we have to ensure that somehow or the other, those at the bottom are brought up. As Swami Vivekananda would always say, that it is easy to pull people down, but more difficult to bring people up. Ramana Loya ironically also said that the whole thing is, he's been misinterpreted various differently. But Ramana Loya also said that the duty of those who are benefited are to ensure that those who are not as disadvantaged benefit, or get that benefit. So it depends upon institutions like NUJS to ensure that this online classes is not restricted only to those who have, those who can economically benefit, or those who have the economic ways and means to do it, but should go to everybody. But does that mean that you should shut down online courses so that no one gets benefit from it? I don't think that serves a purpose. But that now puts a bigger burden on institutions to ensure that the benefits goes to everybody else.
Yeah, and possibly, as we are using online platform, we can make it open to the other law colleges, other students,
Yes.
those who are not from NUJS but take benefit of the lectures of NUJS,
Yes.
or whatever
Yes.
program you are organizing.
Yes.
Yeah. There is one more question from Biswas Agarwal.
Yes.
Biswas is asking that, so do you think that the reservation policy is detrimental for our socialist country like India?
As I said, the fact that we incorporated reservation or affirmative action into our constitution is unique. It was path-breaking when it was done. It was very unusual. So to say that we didn't formulate or we didn't envisage a reservation policy is wrong. And as I always say this, we've come a long way. A lot of the odds have been even. I don't think we can even sort of even contemplate what sort of an unequal society we inherited. But we've evened out a lot of the odds. But my view is, but there's still caste oppression. All of us know it. It may not be so apparent in the cities, where economics may be a criteria for disadvantage, but in the villages, caste still forms. Even in West Bengal, an enlightened state like West Bengal, anyone will tell you, if you go to a village, there is still discrimination based on caste, and it's still there. It may seem unusual for people like us who are in towns and who have this wonderful education, but it still exists. And till that exists, there is scope for affirmative action. I'm very clear on that.
Yeah, Bikramjit, you are so right. In our ancestral place in Birbhum, you see, the people are so accustomed, or they have taken this into the system, that they don't want to come to the temple and enter into the temple and offer puja. They think that they should not do that. That they have already, they have taken it into the system that you may allow us, but we do not want to go in. So it's very 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 true. Mr. Arnab Bosu has a question. It is that what are his views with the way in which socialism was included in the preamble? Why did the Constituent Assembly not include the term into the preamble, into our constitution during its formulation? So possibly that.
I answered that. I think that Baba Saheb Ambedkar was very clear. He got up actually and he said that we don't want to burden the constitution with these values which may change, and we don't want to sort of make it legally implementable. But all the controversial sort of these fantastically interesting ideas, Gandhianism, socialism, etc., were kept in DPSPs, so that governance could be measured upon it. But it was clearly not made legally implementable because Baba Sahib Ambedkar was the person who came out with the actual legal reasoning, and I'm sure there was a thinking behind it, that we wanted the Constitution to be a power controlling document. We don't want values which will color the Constitution.
Yeah. Aditya Rajagopal has a question. Sir, given the court succumbed to government discretion, especially the government of the day when it comes to the socialism, be it the aspect of land acquisition or nationalization.
I'm sorry, once more, Anirban.
Yeah. Aditya Rajagopal is asking, sir, given that court succumbed to government discretion, the government of the day when it comes to the socialism, be it the aspect of land acquisition or nationalization.
Okay. Does the court succumb to that? I think the governments, as well as political parties, and I have a controversial take on that, reflect what the people actually think. That it's very easy to say, and we tend to make that mistake. It takes a burden off ourselves when we say that it's the political parties who are misleading the people. That never happens. People want something, and it's the political parties who articulate that, because in a democracy, that's how they get to power. So in many ways, even the courts reflect that. And this sort of, for the want of a better word, and I'm not quite comfortable with using the word politics, but I'm saying these underlying tensions play out within the court. Because we are all humans, we all come from within the society. And for better or for worse, there is a tendency to reflect the broader consensus. It's another matter what that consensus is, because there seems to be increasingly in India two different consensuses. One is, as Anirban sort of flagged right in the beginning, there is a consensus of Bharat, which has different economic and social consensus, and maybe even political consensuses. And the other is the consensus of India, which is celebrity, which is NUJS, NLS, Vikramjit Banerjee, Anirban, and a lot of us who've traveled the world, who've traveled in India, who had the wonderful benefit of this wonderful education, and including those people who talk on social media, these wonderful celebrities, people who exist on media, they have a different consensus. So on, what is the consensus of India is the question which is coming more and more clashing with each other. But broadly, the court reflects social consensus. Government also reflects that. Courts also reflect that.
Mohammad Zaid has a question.
Yes.
Do you think that court have exhibited undue difference in backing the market-free policies, refusing to entertain challenges thereon on the ground of socialism, diluting socialism to be a pragmatic one?
Yeah. I'll answer that. That's exactly what I was saying, because courts who are judges? The judges are humans. Judges come from society like ours, and we've seen that. I'll say what we have seen, which you haven't seen, and I'm not being facetious. I'm not being patronizing, but that's because we are older. We've gone through a period when we grew up in what we considered a socialist India. Then we saw the development of market economics, and now we see the wheel coming circle. Now, we have seen that the judges also, are humans. They come from a society like us, and they reflect those broader changes in society. The way the courts interpreted socialism in the 70s and the 80s is radically different from what happened in the 90s. And I'm sure, and I'm sure it will interpret it differently after the pandemic in 2020. So that's the entire question. At the end of the day, we are all humans. And, as I think it was, Anirban is great at this. I think was it Oliver Wendell Holmes who said that after judges are all human. And it's absolutely human. And so it's not that they have shown deference. It is just actually they believe that the consensus was that should be more market. Market was a better tool to achieve a better, a fairer society. They actually believed it. I'm not saying that, I know because I was part of it. And I know that in the beginning, as I said, we all thought I screamed personally at socialist professors in the National Law School. And I thought they were completely wrong. And I was genuinely convinced that they were completely wrong. And it's not that I was doing it because I wasn't convinced. It was, that was how it was. So, in many ways, that is how it, I don't think the judges themselves have shown any deference, but the judges have been convinced, and they've been convinced because that was the consensus, existing consensus. Hello, can I be heard? Can I be heard?
Hello?
Hello, can I be heard?
Yeah, so we can hear you. I think Professor Mazumdar had some audio issues. I'll just continue
Okay.
with the question and answer session.
Yes.
So Shreya Stalin asks, Sir, your views on moving towards an economic basis for reservation? Is it time to apply a creamy layer concept in letter and spirit, keeping in mind the recent 10% EWS quota?
See, two things. Number one, I don't want to go into details of the reservation issues, simply because I may be asked to appear in this matter. So I don't want to comment on the nitty-gritties of each and every case. But my view is this, that we need a pragmatic interpretation, whatever be it. We need a pragmatic interpretation of the entire concept of a reservation. And I think broadly, again, the consensus of the country seems to be coming around to that, even from within those people who have benefited from reservation. I have seen this from people who have benefited from reservation themselves, who are willing to give up reservation. And they've been very forthright on that.
Yeah. Is there any other question? Hello, Bikamjit.
Yes.
Bikamjit, can you hear me?
I can hear you. I can hear you now.
Yeah. Because for a few minutes, it got disconnected.
I thought that I couldn't be heard. I thought I couldn't be heard.
No.
I couldn't hear you, and I assumed that I couldn't be heard.
There is one more question, is it? In your moving towards the economic basis for reservation, did you answer this one?
I've answered that. I've just answered.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there any other question?
If there is no other question, shall I call it?
Bikramjit, it was so very interesting. It is always very interesting to hear you. And as always, Bikramjit in his speech has examined socialist view with Indian flavor. And I like that middle part where he examined land reforms, nationalization, labor rights, and reservation from the angle of socialism, and his description of socialism with Indian flavor, historically stressing from the Constituent Assembly debate till today. And I'm sure all the students, they liked it and they were enriched. Bikramjit, it was so nice that you could spend some time from your busy schedule, and we all were benefited. And looking forward to see you again. Thank you.
Looking forward
very
to
much.
Thank you very much.